Good evening. Good evening. Hail to the brave spirits who are here for the Akeda. And it's not entirely a joke. I feel whenever I teach this parsha, I have a heaviness. Because when one teaches, one doesn't want to depress people. So they leave the class in a darker mood than they came in. That there always has to be something luminous about Torah, something that leaves you with hope. But this is definitely a dark story. There is no two ways around it. It's another story, one of the framing stories of Avraham's life. The two Lech Lecha stories. The first story last week was what opened Avraham's life with God, Avraham at that stage. God suddenly, out of the blue, tells him, start traveling to the land which I will show you. And interrupts the steady, regular flow of a human life, in which you can more or less predict what you're going to be doing tomorrow and the day after. If you're really well organized, you even have a diary for next week or next month. And suddenly Avraham is told, drop everything and go, and I'm not telling you where you're going. That's on top of everything. I'm not telling you your destination. So that's a moment of what I'm calling interruption. It's a word that is loved by European thinkers now. The idea of a life interrupted by a call from God, by a call from otherness. Something comes. And we talked about that last week, and we talked about the confusion, and the word we used was perturbation. That's the perturbed state of Avraham, as he is full of wonder and wandering and not knowing what the meaning is, what the obvious aim and meaning is of his life. That's how it starts. Then things get much better later. And in this week's parasha, things really seem to be al derech hamelech. Avraham has found himself. Not only does he have the long-awaited child, the child that was a miracle child, Yitzchak, but he weans him, he brings him up. Things seem to be going well. He deals with his environment in one way or another. He makes peace with Avimelech. And then comes the next Lech Lecha. And God uses the words again, Lech Lecha. And this time he doesn't mean a long physical journey. He means just go, but the main thing is, Vayomer Hashem el Avraham now. Avraham has developed an extra letter to his name. His name has become bigger, Agadla et Shemecha, and he has become in some way bigger and more complex. He's got a hey in his name now, the name of God, or maybe the name of the question, a hey that introduces a question. Now questioning is part of his personality, of who he is, and that's who he is now. And at this point, God says to him, Kach et bincha. Now, the journey is, in a way, a motionless journey. Take your son, your only one, whom you love, Yitzchak, and offer him up on one of the mountains, which I will tell you. Al echad heharim asher omari lecha. So you have to notice that not only is this also an interruption of the general social and existential steadying of Avraham's life, suddenly everything is at risk. But it's also with a sense of suspension, with a sense of not knowing exactly, for a while, not knowing what he's about to do. Even if the while is just a few seconds, why does God delay telling him who is the object of the sacrifice? Take your son, your only one, whom you love, Yitzchak. Rashi detects in this, from the Midrash, the same structure as in the original Lech Lecha. It's something that God is doing here to Avraham in this case, which is not revealing to him right away. That's what God is doing. He is not revealing right away the whole meaning of the command. Not right away. Lo gila mitchila. What is God? From the beginning. So it's really the same question again. Why does God do this? And Rashi here makes a generalization and says, HaKadosh Baruch Hu mateh letzadikim, which is an extraordinary statement. God mateh taf hei hei. God makes human beings wonder. But wonder is too romantic a word in English. Mateh has about it a feeling of lostness, a feeling of I don't know what I need to know. I'm full of questions that are difficult, that are turbulent, perturbing. Why does God do this to tzaddikim? Why does God do this again to Avraham at the end of his life with God? This is the last time that God will actually talk to him. This is the last encounter between Avraham and God. And as in the first encounter, right, years earlier, there is this structure of a suspended meaning, a meaning that Avraham is left in suspense about, at least for the few seconds that it... Now, this is seen as significant by Rashi, and he gives an answer to it. One of his answers, the second answer, actually, is similar to what he said on the first Lech Lecha. That is, kedei lechabev et ha-mitzvah beinav. In order to make the mitzvah, I wanted to translate lechabev, not so much, to make it loved, but to make it intimate to him. That in some way he should have a internal process in himself before he knows for sure what is it that God wants of him. That something in him should already be open and working before God reveals the truth. That's similar to what we said last week. But before that, Rashi says something else, which is quite striking. So as not to throw him into confusion, lo lahamemo, not to throw him into confusion suddenly, a sudden revelation of this dire demand. So not velo tazuach da'ato alav, and that his mind should not. So leave that with a question mark for a moment. What is lazuach? Zayin vav chet. And also v'titaref. In other words, that way madness lies. And Rashi brings into his commentary the possibility of madness here. That Avraham could have gone mad, he could have been driven mad, if the revelation of the actual meaning of what God wants, the word ad Yitzchak, had just been landed on him right away. There has to be some kind of internal, some kind of dialogue with himself, dialogue with God. But I have two sons, I love them both. I can't, all the movements of the mind as it's trying to escape the inevitable, as it's trying to think of alternatives. What else could it be? In a way, it helps to cushion the total madness of an unbearable fact. So God is concerned for Avraham's mind. He's concerned that his mind should retain its integrity in some way. What is lo tazuach da'ato alav? This came as a little surprise to me because I found that my instinct was right, which doesn't always happen. I had a sense of what the word means, and I looked it up, and what do you know? I was right in what I had thought. But it's difficult. The word laziach, that word, tends to mean, I looked it up in Jastrow, it tends to mean in the Talmud, to be cheerful, to be elated, to be overbearing. That you're so full of yourself that you just ignore reality and do what you want to do. Right? In this case, what kind of madness is God worried about with Avraham? Not catastrophic depression, but mania, like religious mania. That he will, in some way, he will be ecstatic. Now, this is not our normal way of running our lives. We don't normally think that would be the first reaction. But people did think that in the past, quite without any irony. Some of the main Hassidic commentaries, the main Hassidic masters, very seriously wrote about that kind of ahava in Avraham, that manic love, let's say, that extreme love that Avraham has for God. And the greatest proof of it was that he was happy to do what God asked him to do. Now, I have to say for myself, I'm going to be very confessional today because it's all about a sensibility here. It's all about how a sensibility reacts to what we read in the text and what we read in Rashi and the Midrash. That's my question today. How do we, living when and how we do now, how do we react to these things? I must say, when I read those Hassidic teachings about Avraham's great love and his disappointment when God says, "Don't do it," you've heard of that, right? The angel has to call out, "Don't do anything to him. Al ta'aseh bo mum." Not even a little blemish, as if somehow he's in a frenzy of some kind, a religious trance. So these Hasidic writers, when I used to read them, I have to say, I would just put them aside mentally. I would just, with great respect, I'm sure they knew what they were saying. They had some parallels in their own experience for what they were saying, but it's not something I could engage with. And I'm used to doing that. One does that sometimes. This is not for me. I can't deal with it. Now, actually, I have to say that it does engage in some way with what Rashi says is what God doesn't want Avraham to have. He doesn't want him to have that immediate rush of commitment and self-sacrifice and the sacrifice of everything I hold dear in his love of God. Avraham Ohavi. Yeshayahu calls Avraham in the name of God. God says about Avraham, he's the one who loves me. He is my lover. He is the one he's Ahava. Now, God specifically wants to prevent that immediate response. And therefore, he draws out the sentence. And therefore, in a longer time frame, he takes 3 days to reach the mountain. Vayhi bayom hashlishi. And again, Rashi asks there, why did it have to be so long? What's this ordeal of a 3-day journey? And the same thing, the same idea somewhere, of to give him time, limalech im libo, to think it over, to be deliberate and conscious of what he's doing, not to be the rush of ecstasy of some kind. So the Hasidic writers don't find their source in this Rashi, it seems to me. That's not. And this Rashi is very interesting. So there is here a suspension of what reaction in him? If you're thinking from a modern sensibility, a catastrophic reaction, somewhere that would totally. If you're thinking a little differently through Rashi, then you understand that there's also a possibility of that other reaction, which to our modern sensibility is not so easily accessible. But that's what Rashi apparently is that's his awareness here. This suspension that we're talking about here then, tiruf adat in the end, that his mind would not be composed, his mind would be the opposite of composed, it would be torn apart. That's not the Avraham that God wants to approach Har HaMoriah. There has to be a 3-day interval of some kind. So where do we go from there? If we're thinking then about, you remember, of course, that God says, Kach na et bincha. Please take your son. What a strange little word there. What is na? Rashi usually says, it's a bakasha. I'm asking you, as if to soften the command status. It's not exactly obedience that God wants, if you take that na seriously. It's, I want your mind to be with me in a very deep way. I want you to come along with me on your internal journey towards Har HaMoriah and towards what you will decide to do in the end. There is now a process, a beginning of a negotiation between God and Avraham. It's not just, here's what I want, obey or don't obey. It's kach na. Na is a connective word. It bridges. When you say please, right, it's not just that it asks for something. It's a very Avraham word. Avraham uses it constantly. Of course, I immediately, all the psukim flee my mind now. All the texts flee my mind. But he says it many times. Imrina, achoti at, yes? He says to Sarah, yes? Please say you are my sister in those strange stories with the foreign kings and not my wife. The plea. Right. And he does it constantly. He does it with the travelers who come to his home. He's constantly nagging because that's who he is. He's a loving person, and he's connective. He's connective and wants to make there be no difference between himself and the other. Of course, there couldn't be a bigger difference between God and a human being, especially when the God here is acting all too alike, all too similarly to what one would expect in the pagan cultures in which Avraham grew up. Where does Avraham come from? Neither Yitzchak nor Yaakov comes from the world that Avraham comes from. Avraham is the beginner, the erste Geworner, Rav Hutner says. He was the first becomer, Geworner, someone who had to move from one world to another. And moving from one world to another here for Avraham must mean that he has to go through a process, and God is actually asking him, not commanding him, are you willing to start thinking about this whole question? And it's a question in which you could have very snap judgments, either absolutely not or absolutely yes. We've seen already those two possibilities. I would never do this. This would be, I've read many, many self-righteous articles in the modern vein, which I'm not totally critical of. I'm there too. In which, what a horror, how could anyone ever agree to such a thing? Obviously, it's totally wrong. But of course, yes. But what I'm going to do all evening now is quibble. I'm going to say, yes, but surely that's not the only way of reacting to the Akeda story. Maybe it's a little more complicated. If you have a relationship with God, right? In that theoretical case, that you have a relationship with God, then surely that also somehow swings things a little bit, makes things a little more complicated. So there could be very, very set responses, either absolutely not, or absolutely yes, right away, or kach na, something here about negotiation, as if God is interested in Avraham's mind. Put it like that again. That he's interested in his mental process, what will go through his mind. It's not just that he should do it, but that how is he going to process it? What's going to happen here? The how of it, not just the what. And the Mea Sheloach will say something of the same kind. I hope we get to it. But basically what he says is this. You may have noticed that in the story itself, there's no use of the word emunah, unless I missed something, in the Akeda itself, of faith. And in English, people very often discuss this story as a story of faith. Kierkegaard, as the great, Avraham is the knight of faith, Knight. It's all about faith. It's a very Christian view, which is certainly a powerful view, but we don't have it in the text. And we have it elsewhere in the story of Avraham, but not here. Not actually here. Here, it's almost as if, I don't know if Avraham has faith in God in this story, whether it's simply a question of faith and obedience, which is the way we tend to read it. You have faith in God, so you obey what he says, and you just go ahead and do it. That's actually quite simple. And the Ishbitzer says, no, it's not like that. Not even in the case of Avraham is it like that. Of the biblical hero, is it like that? Because the command came to him, lo b'mefurash. That's quite startling. It came to him with a certain unclarity. It says, V'ha'elokim nisad Avraham, not Yud-Kei Vav-Kei, the other name for God, which means ba'aspaklaria me'ira. That's how the Zohar puts it. That would mean that God appeared in his full clarity and majesty, and Avraham was completely filled with the impact of God's being, and he knew that that's what God wanted. Instead, it's cloudy. Ha'elokim is the name of lo ba'aspaklaria me'ira, of the unclear revelation, that something comes to him but he's perturbed. It's not something that leaves him just totally... and that means that Avraham has a complex response. The main thing that the Mea Sheloach says, if you want to look at it, it's on your page in number 14, so we have a long way to go to get there, and we probably won't get there. It's actually number 12. Number 12. The main thing he says at the beginning there is that Avram's faith was, when God said, bring him up as an offering, Im kol zeh ha'emin bidvarim harishonim kamo mikodem. What was his greatness, the greatness of his faith? That's an unexpected reading. That he continued to believe in the original promises of God as he had before. That is, in his songs of innocence, in his time of innocence, his youth, his romantic time, when God appeared to him and all was faith and all was promises, so on, he believed him then, even though it was against empirical reality. He didn't have a child. He believed then, and now he still believes in those promises for a future and inheritance and the land and children, even now as he's listening to God tell him, offer up your child. That's his greatness, says the Midrash. That's a very modern reading. He lived at the end of the 19th century, and he shares in some of the moods of the time, some of the spirit of the time, and there is this sense of complexity and the depths of a mind that contains inside itself this and that. On the one hand, an understanding of something grim and realistically desperate, and on the other hand, still room for movement, for hope, for a sense that, but there were other promises. It's hard to hold them together. It's almost impossible logically to hold them together. But the Midrashic is not interested in logic. There are others who discuss it logically, but he is not interested in logic. He's interested in the capaciousness of the Spirit, what the Spirit can actually hold in tension and actually move with it. In some way can do something with it, not be paralyzed by it. Now, this is difficult general material. I'm going to become more specific as we go on. We're going to be talking basically then about Avraham's inner world, a world that it turns out the sages, the rabbinic sages, are so interested in and so perceptive about that they are willing to engage with what we now call the unconscious mind, not just the conscious mind. Avraham, certainly by the time he's become Avraham, he's got that hey in his name, he has become a deep person. He has become a person who has to engage with things that are normally hidden in himself. When God disturbs him in this way, when God comes into his life in this way, he has no choice but to think of what it arouses for him, what it evokes for him. Before we start on our journey, in which we are going to be suggesting, I'm just putting it out here on the table, so that it's not like a detective story. We're not going to be moving towards a surprise at some point. I used to teach this material like that, and I decided that perhaps it should be done differently. That I'm going to say from the beginning that the hidden material in Avram's mind has to do with that midrash that we talked about last week. The midrash, the question of fire, the fiery furnace, the castle on fire. Remember the castle, the whole world is on fire in Avram's imagination. That's how his imagination grasps the world. Where does the image of fire that you find so often about Avraham, in Avraham's experience of his world, where does it originate? Where does it come from? And one level of what I want to talk about is psychoanalytic. That is, to trace it back to an originating event. And the originating event is the fiery furnace, which the Midrash refers to, and Rambam refers to, and Ramban refers to. Everyone refers to it as if it's part of history, as if it's something really to be taken seriously. It's not just a Midrash, as we say, yes? And it's quite surprising, in fact, that these philosophical and historically minded thinkers are willing to acknowledge this Midrash, which has no clue in the text itself, almost no clue. It's all Midrash and what's written about that Midrash. And so in their wake, I want to take that very seriously and to suggest that that's the original trauma. Should I tell the story, or are you all familiar with the fiery furnace? Please don't be shy. Let me see a hand if you want me to tell the story. Oh, okay. I get a chance to tell a story. Avraham as a child, young person, very young, disliked his father's profession, which was he was a merchant of idols. Avraham had already found God in some measure. and therefore he couldn't tolerate. And he went and smashed his father's idols. His father, enraged probably, took him then for judgment to the court of Nimrod, the king. Nimrod challenges him, and he stands by what he's done, and he's thrown into the fire, into a fiery furnace. That's specifically called that, Kifshan Ha'esh. I'm not really sure why it has to be a Kifshan, but there are theories. Yes, all right, the theory is in the Midrash, also a different Midrash, that this connects it with the furnace in which the bricks that were used for building the Tower of Babel were fired. And there's actually a reference to that firing of the bricks in the story of the fire of the Tower of Babel. So that's a connection. I don't know if I'll have time to make that connection as we go on. But what we have then is he is martyred for his belief, and God saves him, and he comes out of the fire. Now, that, I want to suggest, is a founding trauma in Avraham's life. It's used by readers of the Torah, Ramban and the Rambam, to show that Avraham wasn't a nobody when God chose him. That he had already shown his mettle. He'd already shown what he's made of. He'd been willing to stand up for God. But the use I want to make of it is simply to wonder about what this meant to Avraham, this memory of what happened then. And the direction I want to go in, if you have a look now at we're going to jump ahead briefly. If you look now at, excuse me, yes, number 7. This is how Rashi puts it. We read, before the first Lech Lecha, before God first appears to Avraham, that Avraham's brother Haran had died in the presence of Terach, his father. Al Pnei Terach Aviv. A little bit about the biography of Avram, there at the beginning, something about his brother, and the strange fact that he died in the presence of his father. Very enigmatic. What is that supposed to be telling us? So Rashi at first says, in a plain pshat way, he says it simply means he died while his father was still alive. And that's odd enough to invite questioning. Why? That's not the way of the world. But then Rashi goes into full midrashic flight after that, and he translates that sentence with tremendous power. Al yedei aviv met. And the story that emerges is of Avram's brother who is killed by his father. Not just in the lifetime of his father, but by his own father. It was an act of filicide, of killing one's son. How did that happen? Terach, the father, wanted to kill Avraham. Otherwise, why did he take him to court? Obviously, he knew what he was doing. He was executing Avraham. It didn't work out. The brother is standing around thinking, what shall I do if they ask me what I think? And he says, well, if it ends well for Avraham, I will also be on Avraham's side. And if it doesn't, I won't. And it ends well for Avraham. So Haran also says, oh, I'm with God. And he's thrown into the fiery furnace, and he doesn't survive. So what does Avraham remember now of his early, what is there in the infrastructure of his life? Right down there. The fact that his father meant to kill him and actually killed, without meaning to, his brother. Yeah? It's the intention and the action. Freud is very fond of this kind of thing, of splitting into two halves and saying that there's something powerful at the basis that unites the two. That Terach was a filicide, right? That he was someone who killed his child. What would that mean to Avraham later? When he thinks about it later, if he thinks about it later, and that's what I want to try and trace, what would that make him feel or think? What effect would have that? And right away I can say, again, the immediate thought is one of two opposite thoughts. One is that he would think, my father did this to me, I'm never going to do this to my son. And the other is, my father did this to me, and I must do this to my son, therefore. That in some way there's a compulsion. Abusive fathers make abusive sons. That modern wisdom that there is something compelling and compulsive about trauma, that it asks to be repeated in some way, is part of what we now know, but I'm going to suggest is implicitly there in the sources. That Avraham is in a very fraught state for receiving a command like this from God. He's not just anybody who receives this command. He is someone who both loves God and has good reason to fear the gods who would make such demands in the ancient world, and the Father who is the Oedipal Father, the Father who, on the one hand, one may love and who may be loving in certain moods, but it's dangerous to have a father. I don't know where I read that terrible sentence, that having a father exposes you to something other than that there's something else that can happen. Now, if this is somewhere the hidden story of Avraham's life, then what kind of a state is he in during those 3 days? What happens? What's the thinking? What is the thinking feeling that goes on in those 3 days? What I want to do is follow through a theme that you find in the Midrash about Avraham and about his habits, the habits of his inner life. He has a tendency to be meharher. We're going to embark on that in just a minute. Meharher is the evocative, wonderful word, double root, har. He is someone who is often in a situation of having qualms, having misgivings, having second thoughts about things, reconstructing the past, usually in the direction of pessimism, usually in the direction of being very critical of oneself. It's a version of what the French call beautifully l'esprit d'escalier, the spirit of the staircase. What you think when you're walking down the stairs after you've had your important interview, and you're thinking, oh, I should have said that, and I should not have said that, and you have hirhurim. You have hirhurim about the past, as if you couldn't acknowledge the past is past. There's no point in worrying about it, because the truth is the past is not past. The past will have repercussions in the future. I won't get the job, because I said the wrong thing. So the past never can be laid to rest for someone who is this kind of person. Someone who's constantly awake at midnight or later than midnight, thinking through things again and finding reason for unease. There's something very Jewish about it. This is Avraham Avinu we're talking about here. Now, I want to look at some examples of that around the Akeda, how that affects the Akeda. And then I want very briefly to think about the whole idea of the relationship of a human being with fire, with the lure of the funeral pyre, a terrible paradox. The horror of fire, the destructiveness and horror of fire, and the fascination with fire. And that's a difficult piece of what I want to talk about. I'll probably keep it short because it's just almost not healthy to think about it too much, and yet I want to put it out there, that there's a complexity of feeling about the fire. And of course, fire is the Akeda. Right? One of the things that he has to bring with him to the Akeda is the wood for the fire, because it's going to be a totally consumed sacrifice. That's an orla. Yeah? Before we embark, I wanted to read you a little piece from the Nobel Prize speech of the Irish poet Seamus Heaney. Very beautiful, very immediate. He remembers his childhood. Peasant background in Ireland, a farm family, cut off from the world, living a very animal-centered, earth-centered life, many children, Catholic family. And he remembers not knowing anything about the world at that time, cut off from the world. He says, nevertheless, you can see it at the end of the Hebrew sources. I've put it there. We were as susceptible and impressionable as the drinking water that stood in a bucket in our scullery. You couldn't get a more homely comparison. We were like this bucket, Maybe we can all remember such buckets somewhere. Not us, our grandparents, such buckets. Every time a passing train made the earth shake, the surface of that water used to ripple delicately, concentrically, in widening circles and in utter silence. You know how the ripples go, out to the edge and then back again to the center and then out again. That's a physical description of the water being moved by the sound of a train. Oh, there was a train. In that case, they were not totally cut off from the outside world. They never went on the train, but they did hear the sound of the train, and the train disturbed their quiet backwater life, just enough to set a ripple going backwards and forwards. And then he comes back to this a little later, and he says this: I credit poetry. It's his anima amin. Yes, it's his credo. That's the name of his address also, crediting poetry. It's an odd word, credit. I give credit to poetry. I have faith in poetry. I trust poetry. You can feel that there's two sides to it. That against the popular view, against myself, I still believe in poetry. There's a force pulling me away from poetry, but I still acknowledge poetry because poetry can make an order as true to the impact of external reality and as sensitive to the inner laws of the poet's being as the ripples that rippled in and rippled out across the water in that scullery bucket 50 years ago. I credit poetry for making possible a fluid and restorative relationship between the mind's center and its circumference. That's quite abstract. It's like, what do you think is the center? What do you think is the inner life and the outer life? Another sentence he uses later is he talks then about how for many years in his youth he didn't have any patience for poetry because the world was so terrible. The world, this is before the Second World War, he was a child. And as he grew into the world of the Shoah, and he really refers to it in his work. A little digression here. One of his poems describes how he and his many brothers and sisters used to make a little train of their bodies on the sofa. Each one would be holding the body of the one in front, and they would make the movements of a train to give a sense of that exotic world out there that they used to hear through the radio. Oh, a radio as well. There was a radio, and they heard these exotic names of European cities and Polish cities, and somewhere it got a ripple going in them. They acted the train, and then he says, without any conscious knowledge of what trains were doing in Europe at the same time. Now that, somewhere that thought, that something is unconscious still with him then, when he becomes conscious of the nature of the world, the evil of the world, then it becomes impossible to credit, he says, man's capacity for doing anything good and exalted. And somewhere you get a very bad view of what the world is. And it became impossible for him to write poetry with the kind of force of wonder, of the romantic, the belief, the sense of the transcendent. He avoided it in the interest of truth. Truth is the only value. How can you write that kind of poetry when, until somehow he developed, people move to understand that he's still denying a part of the truth. And that somehow he has to find a way of rippling between this and that, between the sense of the grimly true and the social responsibility of his life, not to spoil himself, indulge himself with beauty and imagery and so on, and nevertheless understanding that too expresses part of the truth of his being and finding a way to move between the two. It's a very powerful speech. So I come back to Avraham. Hirhurim. It begins with Hirhurim. Have a look at number 2 on your page. A few examples, quite quickly. Chapter 15, Perek Tet Vav, the covenant between the pieces, begins after Avraham has survived the war between 4 kings and 5 kings, he survived and been victorious in a difficult war. And God says to him, Al tira, don't be afraid. I will protect you and I will give you great reward. And so the question arises right away, and it inspires the Midrash. What was Avraham afraid of? He had a signal victory now. Everything is over. It's all in the past now, the danger. Now he's safe and victorious, so what's he worried about? What is he afraid about? And the Midrash then responds in 3 similar but different episodes by different people, different sages, hypothesizing what he might be worrying about. One is Avraham Haya, the first one, Avraham Haya mitpached. Interesting word. It's not meharher here, he was anxious. He had anxious inner thoughts, reflexive thoughts about himself. And he wondered, he said, would you say, there is that Avraham word. He always begins his wanderings, with the word tomar, very often. Would you say such and such? So you can see already what kind of person he is. He is someone who's not willing to accept the concrete truth of the facts as the truth. The truth is really what the meaning of it is. And he's constantly making meaning, but usually it's discouraging meaning. Usually it's meaning that makes him feel bad. Would you say, for instance, number 1, would you say that among all those many people I've just killed, there's been a lot of killing going on now? There is one righteous person, one righteous, God-fearing person. Now notice, he's not just saying one innocent person. It's in that form that the moral question arises now, very often in war. What can we do about what they sweetly call collateral damage, collateral damage, which actually means the death of civilians. So as soon as we raise that question, someone raises that question, then you'll get a response. One response is yefei nefesh. Isn't that an unnecessary worry? The main thing is we won the war, and wars entail collateral damage. It's just the fact that's how it is. On the one hand, one might have that reaction. On the other hand, and here Avraham is adding to the stakes by saying it's not only an innocent person, but it's someone who's a God-fearer. Where am I then? How can I live with myself if I've done that? So another reaction might be to say, well, I wish we were all as scrupulous as Avraham, that we all had moral misgivings about ourselves, that we are prone to misgivings. I don't see that on the whole, most people are over-prone to misgivings of this kind, unless they keep it for the middle of the night when one doesn't observe it. But people in general try to cover up for themselves. But Avraham is exposed in some way. His nerves are exposed, and he worries about it. And God reassures him. And I won't even go into how God reassures him, but he says, don't worry, there's nothing for you to worry about here. This was all part of, you're doing my work. Second possibility, Avraham said, would you say that these kings I've just killed will have left children behind them, and their sons will turn up in a few years, and they'll take revenge? That's a different kind of worry. That's not an ethical concern, that's a survival concern. My life is not yet fully safe, because there could be a terrible, what's the word I'm looking for, backlash. There could be consequences to what has just happened. And that's another kind of concern that one has sometimes, even in modern times, about an apparent victory, which the price may be too heavy in the long run. So the past and the future are not unconnected. But the third suggestion of what he's worried about doesn't fit easily into our usual ways of thinking. Avram worries, and he says, Tamar, would you say that I've received all my reward in this world, and in the next world, where it matters, ein li klum. I don't have a thing to stand for me. This is one of the theological responses to the question of the wicked who prosper in this world. So one of the things that's said sometimes is, but they're being paid in this world's pleasures and success for every good thing they ever did. When it comes to the next world, oh, that's serious. God answers Avraham, don't worry. Everything good I did for you in this world, I do for you in this world, is chinam. It's intriguing. It's not a reward at all. It's just, I like you. It's just love, chinam. Maybe loving people get love in response. I don't know, maybe. But Avraham is so loving that God loves him back. But in the world to come, you come with with everything good you ever did in your life, and you don't come without anything. Don't worry about that you're going to be without a stitch to wear when you get to the world to come. Now, I'm not so much interested in the answer here, although it's certainly intriguing, as with the question again. Why is Avraham so worried in all these different levels? Right? The sages try to think of every different level in which he might have been worried. That his reflexive habit of mitpached, to gnaw at himself, to worry actually means to gnaw at oneself, yes? Like to worry at meat, an animal worries at food. That's where the Anglo-Saxon word worry comes from. So, right, we are worriers. What can I say? I can only comfort myself by thinking I have a great forebear here, that it came from Avraham Avinu somewhere. Do you think of this as scrupulous? Is this, all right, put it like this. This is something I learned. There is scrupulousness and there is scrupulosity. Have you come across this? Scrupulousness is the virtue of being very scrupulous. I'm not dishonest by even so much. Even if it's nothing that I've got that I don't really deserve, I'll feel bad about it till I've managed to restore it. And there are all kinds of stories of tzaddikim, of good people like that who are so, and we usually admire it. But then there's scrupulosity, and that's a word that's been invented to describe a kind of neurosis. When you think it's a neurosis, right, it's a matter of how you take it. You look at it and you think, oh, well, that's a little off. Can't he just enjoy his life? It's too much. It's just out of proportion. So it's a question of sensibility. How do we read such texts? How do we think of people who do there isn't a clear line between the two, objectively. So it's almost a question of our hirhurim about hirhurim. How do we, what kind of meanings do we attach when we see someone who is very anxiously fulfilling a mitzvah, for instance? Right? You sometimes see this. You see it often with Baalei Tshuva, with people who are new to it. And there they are clearly kind of frantically engaged in every detail of the mitzvah, and they have no room for anything else in their minds, and so on. So nowadays, it's very easy to take the neurotic approach. Different people will have different reactions to it. Some people will have a certain respect for it. A certain respect because it's serious. Because this is a person who really does feel that in some way. But hirhurim, let's get back to the word. All right, let's progress a little bit first and then think about the word. Acharei hadvarim ha'ele, number 3. It's almost the same expression that introduces the Akeda, but it's after the Akeda. The end of the parsha doesn't end with the Akeda. After these things, vayugad la'Avraham, Avraham was told family news from abroad. And suddenly we have a list of names from his family abroad, and Rivka was born among other children, and that's how the parsha ends. There's a kind of anticlimax to the parsha. And here Rashi gives us this story. When Avraham came back from Mount Moriah, he was meharher. He was second-guessing, and he was thinking, ilu, that's another word of this kind. What if my son had already been slaughtered, he would already have gone without children. In other words, look what almost happened. Unawares, I just let him grow happily in a prosperous world. Everything seemed fine at that time, before the Akeda. I wasn't in a hurry to get him married. There's more to say about that, but let's just take it like that. I wasn't in a rush. But now that I see what almost happened, I feel culpable retroactively. I almost lost the whole future because I should have married him off while the going was good. Now, that's the kind of mental process that I think can draw out different responses from people. What do you think of that kind of thinking? God reassures him and says to him, Rivka is born. So the list of births there was really to reassure him in his anxiety about meaning and about the loss of meaning that he's responsible for. I do detect here a slight, pat from God. He was sort of pat on the shoulder, saying, "Really, Avraham, it's not all up to you. I appreciate your responsibility. But there is also a God in the world that may be also. I could also look after. I do one or two things too. So you're not totally responsible for everything. Now, all right, that's one possibility anyway. What's a hirhur? I want to say the classic form of hirhur is hirhurim ra'im. Bad hirhurim, sexual hirhurim, hirhure avera. That's the classical fantasies. But I think even when it's not avera, when it's something more, we don't know whether it's good or bad, something like this, there's a sense of being possessed by thoughts. That you are not actually creating those thoughts on the conscious level, they're coming up. They're coming up and they won't let you go. And that feeling of an otherness in your own mind, that is Avraham, strangely. Avraham, who seems very much a surface person. He's chesed, he's out there, he's connecting with people. But where does he draw the perfume that entrances people, according to that midrash last week? It must be from something beneath consciousness in himself. And there's the irony, that sometimes people who are very charismatic and very charming and good with people have a dark side in themselves. That is, they suffer. That these are people who suffer from depression very often, and nevertheless, there are the two sides. And we seem to be given a sense of this with Avraham, chesed, a charmed life. It's been good for me. Look at the next one now. The next source. This is the Akeda itself. One of a whole cluster of such sources. Achar hadvarim ha'ela, number 4. After these things. After what things? No, forget, it's not after these things. It's achar hirhurei dvarim shahayu sham. It's a very fine reading. Midrash comes and says, after the thoughts about the things that happened here. What we're interested in here is not what happened to Avraham on this level. We're interested in what did he think about what had happened to him. What was his inner life like? Hirhurei dvarim, mi hirher, Avraham hirher. Look how many times the Midrash manages to put in the word hirhur, in three times in 6 words. Hirhur, hirhur, hirhur. You get a sense of the obsessiveness of it. That it really was all Avraham. Avraham was just full, he was dense with hirhurim. Call it imagination. That's one way of talking about it. He had a fertile imagination of a certain kind. Amar, what did he say? What was he maher about? Samachti v'simachti et hakol. I've rejoiced and I've made everyone rejoice. Which always seems to me an amazing, what a wonderful heading for a life. I've managed to live my life in joy, spreading joy around me. What could be better? What could be wrong with that? What's he going to worry about here? V'lo hifrashti lakadosh baruch hu. Now you hear his worry, his destructive worry. I have not set aside for God, hifrashti, separated out from those groaning tables of food where I would entertain passers-by. I had an open tent, everyone would come, everyone would make brachot, simcha filled the air, but I didn't take any part of that food and set it aside for God. I didn't actually offer up a sacrifice of any. What is Avram's worry here? It's a worry, it seems to me, about seriousness. If you have had a good life, right? Gratitude, of course, is one response. But there might, if one is a serious person, there might also be other responses. Perhaps I'm just looking to gratify myself in my religious life. It's been so good for me, the whole thing. Everything has been so healthy and so prosperous and connective and community. Many of the, sometimes I feel in our time, that's the main argument that religious people make to defend religion in the world. that basically what they want to say, and it suits our time, is to say how happy the whole thing is. What a happy life I have being a religious person. How good it is for me. I have community. I don't have depressions. I've left fewer depressions. All the things that the researchers have come up with. The benefits of a religious life. But that utilitarian view of religion, don't you ever worry that maybe I haven't really got everything that religion is about? Maybe it's not there just to make me feel good. And that's the acid test of whether something is doable or not. Maybe there should be some korban. And there is the idea of setting something aside, simply making space, diminishing myself rather than expanding myself. It's a difficult idea to sell nowadays, and I count myself as a contemporary. That is, I don't think I'm exempted from it. I also feel that the acid test is happiness. On some level, I tend to feel that. Vitality, life, that's what seems to signify the right kind of life. But does nothing in us ever have a dream of something else, an otherness in life? Fasting. What do you do when you fast? You diminish yourself. I hate fasts, personally. I would much rather not. Every time, because I don't feel expanded. I feel diminished. I'm not functioning as well as I usually do. I can't think. I can't feel as well. It's different. I become smaller. And then sometimes I think maybe that's what it's about. There should be one day, certain days, in which I become aware of something else, that there is an other. And the other makes demands sometimes to create some space. Diminish yourself, create some space. Maybe that'll be a different way of interacting with divinity, with that who commands, that one who commands. Here, that's what he worries about, and God reassures him.
Excuse me, can I just ask, are we focusing still on the 3-day journey?
No. We're now talking about Avraham's inner life, and we'll come back to. Yes, about what goes on in his mental life, which the Midrash does give us a picture of, unexpectedly. You don't always expect that, but unexpectedly, that's what we're being led into here. And God answers him. It's a powerful answer. I do take you seriously. I know that all your pleasure and all your joy was on condition. In other words, it was always contingent on the fact that if I were to ever to ask you for the ultimate sacrifice, you would not hold back. So I credit you. God's answer to Avraham is, I believe in you. I don't know about you, it's not so much Avraham believes in God, but God believes in Avraham, and so he's not displeased with Avraham's life of joy at all. But now the time has come, perhaps, to call in the debt. Miyad va'elokim nisad Avraham. Immediately, God tested Avraham. You can see it at the end of the Midrash there. What's the force of immediately here? It's not just time, quickly. No. It's more, you said it. It came from you. The reason God tests Avraham is because in Avraham himself there is a desire for reality testing. Am I serious? Am I not serious? And God says, hypothetically, I always knew you were serious. I don't need to test you. But I see there's something in your relation with me that does require pushing it to the end. And Avraham is now launched in this grueling process of being taken seriously, which comes from himself, in a certain sense. In the next few minutes.
These insights are coming on the way back.
No. This is before the Akeda. Before, I'm sorry. Vayihi achar hadvarim ha'ela is before the Akeda. And that's where the Midrash comes in and says the Akeda was caused by these hirhurim that Avraham had. That's what gave birth to the test. Which is, I'm sure you realize what a supposition this is, the force of such an idea. the part I don't want to talk about now at great length, I just want to gesture at very briefly. What is fire? What does fire mean in the thought of three French philosophers? I'm going to focus very briefly on one or two of them. The first one is Gaston Bachelard. I've mentioned him before. Bachelard. He was a psychoanalyst and a philosopher. He writes a book called The Psychoanalysis of Fire. Another book called Water and Dreams. Another book called Air and something else. In other words, he takes material experiences, empirical experience, water, fire, and he thinks, what do they get going inside us? What do they mean to us if we start daydreaming about them? What is there in our unconscious that comes up, for instance, when we stare for a long time at a fire in a fireplace? And he says that's the position, that's the posture of the first philosophers. And what you are seeing is immediate dramatic change between life and death. You are looking at the drama of life and death in the fire. That here is something, a solid twig, a solid branch, leaves, and you just watch as it just curls up and becomes a wisp. So it must raise certain fears, certain desires. And that's the less publishable part of it, that there could be also a certain desire for instant glorious death. That suddenly the kind of, he mentions, I won't go into all the specifics of it for lack of time, he's quoting Georges Sand, a daydream by a fire on Mount Etna, the volcano. And the dreamer thinks, the daydreamer thinks, I'm looking into a fire which is a miniature version of the volcano, actually. It's a manageable, right? I'm not afraid of this fire. But I'm looking here at how I would be looking, but I'm looking, what could there be up there by the volcano? Here it's safe to think it. The strange lure of the funeral pyre. The ants who are rushing and hurling themselves in some kind of frenzy, it looks like, into the fire. Now, I don't know what the ants think about all this, but this is a human fantasy. It's human beings. Sorry? Yes, yes. It arouses all kinds of horrific images of widows throwing themselves into their dead husband's fires, ancient mysteries, the ancient Greek mysteries, the pre-Hellenic mysteries, terrible things that happened in caves where children were sacrificed, where minotaurs were waiting to torment you, all as part of a negotiation with the gods in some way. But the reverie of fire is something that we can all engage with. And what comes up is material that's a little disturbing, because somewhere there is that attraction, that fascination. I'll just quote one sentence. He says, it's the fascination with the idea of losing everything to gain everything. I think I spent a lot of my childhood fascinated by that idea. There's a confessional statement. The kinds of things I read, the novels I read, were always about glorious self-sacrifice, sort of surrender for the sake of someone else.
Shahada.
Yeah. Or The Tale of Two Cities. Has everyone read The Tale of Two Cities? Yeah. Sidney Carton, who's a disreputable character, not a very good person, does tshuva. He repents and redeems his whole life by going to the guillotine instead of his righteous friend, his friend who has lived a good life. So he gives up his life for his friend, and the last words of the book, I remember buckets of tears I would shed over the ending of the book. It is a far, far better thing I do now than I have ever done. It's probably true. He hasn't done much good in his life, but that's the whole point. I'm reaching a kind of crescendo here. I'm going out in a flare of fire, and I'm saving someone. All right, if you're saving someone, there we're less ambivalent. That we're pretty comfortable with. But what if you're not saving anyone? It's just going up in the fire like that. There is a fascination. You're gaining everything in some way. Georges Bataille, a really radical French philosopher, adds this level of the idea. He says there are two orders of being. One is the everyday way we live. We live as things in a system in which everything wants to live as long as possible, wants a duration, to go on living as long as. That's why I put up with a boring job in order to earn a living, so I can survive. The idea is just going on being, and I give up every kind of intensity or meaning in order just to. The other order of being, he calls the order of intimacy. Intimacy is dvekut. Intimacy is in the most inner place. I want to become one with God. I want to become one with everything that is transcendent. That's the fire. That's the going into the fire. He has a sentence again that I'll just quote as a sample. I think it's quite evocative. He talks about a violent, uncalculated generosity. It doesn't always have to mean dying. It's a violent, right? It's getting both sides of it. A violent, uncalculated generosity. Who's not attracted to uncalculated generosity? There are moments when you would give everything. You would give everything, certainly for the good of something, and sometimes even just lishma. Just a feeling of a yearning for some kind of apotheosis, for transformation that would translate you into different terms. That's intimacy. Now, very difficult notion, and he acknowledges it himself. The danger of fire, the danger of too much fire. We have I'm not going to talk about my third, and I'm not even going to closely attend to the passage from the Gemara about Rabbi Elazar ben Durdea, which is on your page. Is there such a possibility? This midrash raises the question, is there a possibility? Number? Anyone? Yes, 5. The Gemara in Avodah Zarah. Is there a possibility that someone could redeem his whole misspent life in one flash through an intensity of tshuva in which one basically dies? One throws oneself into an internal fire. One gives up one's life in sheer longing to overcome the barriers of one's life, the limitations of one's life. Rabbi is very upset about the idea that is a possibility. Yesh shekoneh olamo b'kama shanim veyesh shekoneh olamo b'sha'a achat. But he has to come to terms with it, it seems. He says there are those who acquire their full world, the fullness of life over the course of many years. Gradually, with discipline, you become the right kind of person. And there are others who do it in one flash, in one, you might say, suicidal moment, in a moment of unbearable and almost beyond choice, hurling oneself to another place. And not only that, they get called Rabbi when they arrive in the world to come. Right? It ends with this really rueful reflection. Here I spent my whole life earning the term Rabbi, that I should be called Rabbi. And this man, this low life, in one moment, he turned things around. Now, difficult. I move from the French to us. Is it possible to cling to God? Ask the sages. That's the ideal, dvekut. To cling to God, to become one with God. Every mystic knows something of this. That's the desire. To give up my literal reality, my concrete, limited reality, and just melt, dissolve. Is it possible to cling to God as a general ideal for everybody? V'chi hu esh ochla. But he is a consuming fire. This is in the Gemara. Yeah? You can't cling to a consuming fire. Think what you're imagining here. So how do you do it? Dvekut. V'atem hadvekim b'Hashem chayim kulchem hayom. The amazing thing is, you are dvekim. Those who are dvekim are still alive to tell the tale. Normally, dvekut should mean the full intensity of it. Should mean ecstatic surrender, ecstatic disappearance. What should you do if you want to express dvekut to God? For instance, if you're a rich man, marry your daughter to a Talmid Chacham. We're way back into the real world of shidduchim and money. How can you help the way of God in this world? How can you help the divine in this world? Well, further their financial interests. If you have good advice, give them financial advice. Give the Talmid Chacham good advice. Now, look what small currency we have to propose by way of translating the ideal of dveikut into livable terms. And I think it's possible again to feel a little ambivalent. On the one hand, life is a good thing, no question about it. Our way is in general not the way of self-immolation, or even more, doing it to one's son. And yet, at the same time, isn't there a bit of a come down here? And when you look at Jewish societies, do you really feel that intensity of the call of dveikut in these acts? The ideal would be that you would feel that desire while you are doing these apparently banal things, creating good relationships with those who are seeking the divine in the world, and so on. All right. Avraham, we have just a few minutes. Avraham and fire in his life. Over and over again, we see strange appearances of fire in the story of Avraham. I'm going to just mention 3 such appearances. The first, that is the last in chronological order, is after Sodom. After Sodom goes up in fire, Avraham looks over Sodom, and what he sees is Hinei Kitor Haaretz, Allah Kitor. Behold, the smoke of the earth, of the land, rose up Kitor HaKivshan, like the smoke of a furnace. Now that's an image. That means it comes from his imagination. The fire was real. But what the Torah is interested in is Hinei. How did Avraham perceive that fire? For him, it took the shape of a smoky furnace.
Would
Now,
that be a clue to why Chachamim created the Midrash of the Kivshan?
my immediate response is that it would be the opposite. That it would be the opposite order. That the Midrash of the Kivshan is very ancient. That's kind of primal. And I am now, in a very slight and you might think over-reading way, noticing there's a Kivshan in his fantasy here, in the way he's thinking. I'd have to think a little more about what you suggested.
I just said that because the text of the Torah was before that.
Of course, no question. The text of the Torah is before. All right, let me just say that you might have a little flicker of interest when you see why is it so specific, a furnace, at this point. But it doesn't relate to anything in the Torah, so we could easily put that aside. But then again, what do we have before Sodom? Avraham says to God, he pleads with God for Sodom, and he says simply, Anochi afar va'efer. I am dust and ashes, and that's a kind of modest, demurral. Who am I, after all, to argue with you? So I am just dust and ashes. But look at how Rashi reads it. Number 6. Anochi afar va'efer, ukvar hayiti ra'ui liyot. I should already have been dust at the hands of the kings. In other words, I should have lost my life in that war. Ve'efer al yidei Nimrod, and ashes at the hands of Nimrod. Now there is that. Rashi is bringing up that midrash now in order to explain, to give a literal meaning to dust and ashes. Now, you might say it's not concrete, it's just a figure of speech. I am just dust. It's what we call a dead metaphor. But then I would have to say that dead metaphors were always once alive. They didn't start off as dead. They kind of died over the years. But they had originally some more concrete meaning. And Rashi is trying to get at that here. Why would Avraham use that expression, that loose expression, afar va'efer? And he gives it, I should already be dead, and really what he's actually saying is, I am ashes. He's not saying I should. That's how Rashi translates it, but Anochi afar va'efer. I've suffered a trauma at the beginning of my life that on some level I have survived, but on some level I'm still there. Anochi afar va'efer. Now that's a very internal meaning. How far do we feel justified in going with a meaning like that? But by the time we move on and see more and more examples of references to the fiery furnace, indirect references, not only in the Torah, but in the Midrash, of course. The third example, of course, was the one we looked at already, where his brother dies at the hands of his father. And Rashi there explains it as meaning that he dies because of that whole episode of the fiery furnace, which means that Avraham may not even consciously remember that fiery furnace. So far do these things go in terms of trauma studies now. That what characterizes trauma, it seems now, we seem to understand, is the fact that I've forgotten what happened. To a great extent, I don't really have access to what happened. There is just something there that undermines. And I know there is something there, and a therapeutic treatment would have to in some way try to revive some of that, to bring back that situation so as to be able to put it in the past, so as to be able to say that was, but that no longer is. Meantime, one is haunted. It's a kind of ghost. There's a ghost there. Let's have a quick sweep now. The next source on your page, number 8. When God originally said to Avraham, Lech Lecha, we're going back to the original one, and I'm not going to read, I'm going to paraphrase for speed. Avraham was, what's the word that's used there? Lefi shehaya Avraham Avinu mefached. He was afraid. He was afraid of God's command. Why? Because of the meanings he associated with God's command. I will create a Chilul Hashem, he says. I will profane God's name because people will say, look at this man who is called to follow a brave new religion at the cost of his aged father. That he's abandoning his aged father to go off and follow an invisible God. That's the great new religion, and it will be a Chilul Hashem. I'll be doing something negative, and he's really worried about this. He's afraid of this, as he tends to be. And God answers him strangely. Everyone else is obliged to honor their father. You I absolve of that. Now, if you've ever read the passage in the Shulchan Aruch about honoring one's parents, and the question then about, is anyone exempt from this? It turns out there are fewer exemptions than you might think. Even if your father hasn't been nice to you, even if, he shouldn't do what he's done, but you still. But here God is saying, and it's an extreme statement, and you're a potter, you don't have to honor your father. You shouldn't be anxious about this. What could justify that, if not the memory of the fiery furnace story? That your father unfathered himself. He put an end to that relationship when he made to destroy you. Now, it's a hypothesis there. Again, I'm going to miss out the next two sources and come to Har HaMoriah itself. Right? We're finally approaching Har HaMoriah, and we have 10 minutes. 10 minutes. He saw the place from afar, the place. God said, I'll tell you. How did the place look from afar? Kind of bird's eye view. It teaches you that at first this place was a deep place, makom amok. Not a mountain at all. You have to imagine, actually, it was in a valley. And when God wanted to dwell there and make a Beit HaMikdash there, that the temple would be built on that site, he said it's not fitting for a king to dwell in any other than a high, exalted, miyupeh v'nir'eh lakol, in a place that is miyupeh. Miyupeh means something very close to sublimated, improved, refined, primal religious impulses that have somehow achieved some kind of refinement and visible to all. No mysteries and caves. That's not where I want to dwell. It's not fear that should rule the religious experience. It's fear of God. And that's a very interesting, it seems like no distinction at all. What's the difference between fear and fear of God? There is a difference. The kind of fear that God wants, this is material we didn't get to in the rest of the shir, has to do with a particular kind of work on oneself. It's not the instinctual fear that everyone feels of terror and what the gods can do to me. You know, that shouldn't be the basis of a sublimated religion, of a religion that's refined. It comes from the same impulses. It starts down there, but it has to end up there, not in a cave, not in an Ur. Have you heard of the great cave of Ur? The great pit of Ur. 2600 BCE. Apparently at that time they found the archaeological evidence. When a king died or a queen died, the servants, large groups of servants, would immolate themselves. They would go down into this pit where they'd be buried in the pit, perhaps aided by drugs. There are hypotheses about this, that they would be somewhere stunned, they would be in some kind of a trance, and they would go down there and be buried. This is this horrifying place in which a certain kind of idealism, it's a certain kind of worship here, is played out. And God says no to the cave and the low place. It has to be in a high place. How do I make it high? Well, in mythic terms, God is God is God. So from God's point of view, all he does is give a command, a hint, a remez. He gives a hint to all the tectonic plates, and what was low becomes high, and what was high becomes, and suddenly you have a mountain in place. And what makes this, I think, so interesting is it's all focused on what Avraham saw from afar. That Avraham has some kind of a vision of this process now, of what it means in human terms. What's required of him to take material that's deep, that's very inward, and in some way dubious, in some way full of murky, full of questions. What do I do about this? How do I take this? And to find a way of laha'alot, ha'alehu la'olah, a kind of alternative meaning of ha'alehu la'olah that Rashi already brings up, that the Midrash brings up as a possibility. Now, I want to finish, we have 5 minutes, and so I want to finish with what happens at the Akeda and after it, very, very briefly. At the Akeda, it's not God who stops Avraham, but an angel who calls out from heaven and calls Avraham's name twice. Avraham, Avraham. And there's a little line, a vertical line between the two namings of Avraham. To which the Zohar says, it makes a great deal of this, that Avraham is addressed twice, Abraham Rishon, lo kamo Avraham Aharon. That Avraham was not the same person, that all this split in his being between the loving, faithful side of himself, the romantic side of himself, and the side that has very difficult things to deal with about everything. It focuses narrowly now on the last minute when the angel calls out. When the angel calls the first time, Avraham can't hear him. The Kli Yakar says something like this. He is nidham. He's in a trance of some kind. It's a trance of a religious trance. I'm just going to go ahead and do it. I'm in the middle of it. I'm going to go ahead and do it. By the time the angel calls a second time, he can hear the angel call. So the angel is a kind of transitional being. It is part inner life, part something calling from outside. Avraham moves. The negotiation between the two sides moves so that he's on the other side. What could have been a very low place, climbing the mountain, could have been going down into a pit. And instead, but Avraham is not satisfied. At the end of the story, right, the Midrash you have at the end, Midrash Tanchuma, I'll summarize very briefly. God is blessing him at the end, all kinds of blessings for the future, your children. And Avraham interrupts God. If the story began with God interrupting Avraham, here Avraham interrupts God. And he says to him basically, I have something to say. And God says to him, please, go ahead. Let me hear what you have to say. God is interested in Avraham's mind, always, even when he's being interrupted. And Avraham basically says, first of all, did you have to do this to me? It's in very colloquial language. "אתה צריך לעשות לי כן?" You know what was in my heart. You know about my love. You know everything about me. Couldn't you just take for granted the whole story and leave this out? This whole painful process that I had to go through. And then he goes on, and he says, I had plenty I could have answered you. When you said to me, take your son, I had lots of objections to make, logical objections about your promises and so forth. I restrained myself, and I think I should get credit for restraining myself. Why? Here I suggest. Why is it good in this case for Avraham to restrain himself when he's never restrained himself before, for instance, in the story of Sodom? If he had something to say to argue with God, he argued with God about justice. Here, he thinks it's a good thing that he restrained himself. So my feeling is that in dealing with such material, immediately to go and complain and rebel and protest is in a way to deny the material. That really what he had to do was live with the material in himself. He had to find a way of getting that ripple going somewhere between the inner and the outer. Just to complain and rebel, it wouldn't have served any purpose for him, because it's an inner thing that he's involved in here. So I would like that you should give me something very important because of my restraint, he says to God. My children will sin, and I want you, when they do, I want you to remember the Akeda and redeem them and forgive them. A priori, lechatchila. That is, your role in the human world will be to make use of this almost Akeda, what I did here, and take that as a credit for all generations to come, so that there will be instant redemption for everyone. Now that we recognize from another religion, in which it is a very important redemptive belief that one man died and everyone else is saved. And I have no mockery for it in the slightest. I don't have any ridicule. I've known Christians, I've read about Christians for whom that is the saving principle of their life. It doesn't mean they're less moral than others. It's a different order of redemption. But God says, again, very colloquially to Avraham, he says, you said what you had to say, and now I'll say what I have to say. So here is the dialogue. Avraham has initiated a dialogue that interrupts the closure of the story of the Akeda. The Akeda was working its way to a nice closure of blessings by God, and Avraham interrupts with these questions he has and these demands that he has of God now, and God answers. God's answer is this: your children will sin, and then there will be Rosh Hashanah. And if they seek, im yivakshu, vakesh, if they seek for me to remember the Akeda, then they should blow the shofar. Now the shofar is an unknown word at this point. No one's ever heard of a shofar. The shofar of this one. And Avraham turns around to, what? It's right behind you. There is the aisle right behind you. I don't have time to develop this whole scene as it needs, but the point simply is, what God will give Avraham is not what Avraham asked for. What God says to Avraham is, it's always going to be in the human court first. You have to desire. Your children will have to want to engage with the Akeda, to save the Akeda in some way so that they can use it for their future, so that they can use it and ask God to look at it in a certain way. But all the suggestion will come, the desire will come from the human beings. If there isn't that, then there isn't a kind of deus ex machina. There isn't a God who just kind of descends from the upper worlds and forgives you in a routine kind of way. So the rebalancing of what Avraham wants, on the one hand, total forgiveness, with the desperate situation of evil in the world, of people who've done bad things in the course of a year. What could possibly set currents going, between those two possibilities, ripples going between the two possibilities, would be a human desire that there would have to be a human desire, a bakasha, a quest that God should remember. And that has meaning in human terms. What do we mean when we talk about God remembering something? It's very hard to think of it in any other than human terms. We bring it to mind, and we'd like it to be foremost, as it were, in God's mind. And that, God says, yes. That's the way it will go. So God is saying, yes, but, and the but is a way of saying they will have to want, and they will have to be willing to go through an Akeda of their own on some level on Rosh Hashanah. That is, on some level to go through a process in which they also face the depths and bring out from their own idiosyncratic reality something that can rise up and connect with the transcendent. Shabbat Shalom.